Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. In my recent video on the God of the Gaps, I got some interesting answers as to why this sort of thing gets brought up. And I want to discuss one of them today. It's what you might call the atheist creation myth for religion. It tends to go, there are actually several, but this is a popular one and related to the God of the Gaps. It tends to go something like this. Back in the bad old days of mankind, people had no idea how the world worked, so they made up stories that there were gods who did everything. Why did it rain? There's a god. Why is there an earthquake? Because there's a god. Why is the wind blowing? It's a god, etc. And the idea then is that over time, people figured out why these things happened, and so instead of the wind blowing because it was a god, there's a differential pressure. Hot air, cold air pushes, etc. And, why does it rain? Well, because there's rain up in the condensation of water in the clouds until eventually it gets too heavy and falls. And so on. So all these places where there had been gods, this got, knowledge erased the gods from there, replacing them with natural phenomena. And so over time, it kept, the realm in which there were gods kept on shrinking until eventually there are only a few places left. And so all gods are gods of the gaps, and that's all we're left with. Now, this story is basically complete nonsense. Now, a lot of Christians, I think, when they see this, will go for the explanation of, well, this is to completely misunderstand the nature of God. Bishop Barron has, a bunch of videos where he points out that God is the answer to the question of why is there something rather than nothing, not to how does the natural world work. And, it's anyone with any sort of philosophical bent is very tempted to go in that direction, I think. However, and while that is important, however, it is in some sense only somewhat relevant because this isn't even a true history of how any sort of religion got started. I mean, you will find, granted, the occasional thing where somebody will say that, like, what is thunder? Oh, that's that's Thor fighting trolls or something like that. But were these people serious? Because there are parts of the country in which, when it rains when the sun is out, what in my part of the country we call a sun shower, there are people who call this something to the effect of the devil is beating his wife. Now, does anybody mean to suggest that the people from this area genuinely thought that when rain is falling but the sun is out and it's not particularly cloudy up in the sky, that literally this is when the devil is hitting his wife repeatedly? Do any of these people even believe the devil has a wife? In terms of their actual religion. Most of it would be Christian, and Christians do not believe that angels get married. You can actually find in the Gospels when Jesus is talking about how people in the resurrection will be like the angels and will not marry nor be given in marriage. The idea that these Christians actually genuinely thought that the devil was married and that this water falling from the sky was in fact the scientific explanation of the devil, beating his wife is absurd. And in fact, as an experiment, go ask them, is this your scientific explanation for where that water is coming from? That in fact the devil is up there hitting his wife repeatedly and that's why all this water is falling. See how many people say, yep, that is hard science, that is in fact where this water is coming from right now. Now, nobody has any evidence that those sorts of stories were anything but that sort of thing. Colorful ideas because they are fun to tell, because most people understand stories and understand things like being fun. Occasionally, too, there's an odd habit fallen humanity has where people like to tell silly stories to children. But take a look at Santa Claus. Atheists love Santa Claus because Santa Claus was a case where their parents lied to them for some definition of lie, depending on the parent and the child and how you want to define lie. Is anyone actually thinking that this is a scientific, bad science, that this is the parents' best explanation as to where the presents that they themselves are putting under the tree came from? Again, anytime we have instances of stories like this in the modern world, you can see that these are not bad science. These are not an attempt to explain nature. These are an attempt to do things like have fun. Now, moreover, there is another case where we see like stories about gods, because the gods had adventures, they had escapades where, there were seductions and all sorts of things that you find in the ancient stories. Well, look at modern tales of gods told by entirely secular people. Comic books. These are, at the very least, demigods, and many of them are actually like gods in terms of the amount of power which they have. And in fact, many of them are even called gods within the context of the comic books. There are comic books about Thor, for example. Modern secular people tell stories about gods going on adventures and fighting monsters and doing things like that. Now, do these people tell these things as ways of explaining natural phenomena that, that time the building fell down, that's actually because Spider-Man had, punched the vulture and, through one of the girders, and that's why the building fell down? Is that why comic books exist, to explain those sorts of things? The reason why the elevator didn't work was because Dr. Octopus has an evil scheme that involved taking out the elevator in your building? No, people don't do that. They don't do anything like that. That's not why these stories existed. These were the public entertainment of the day in the ancient world. All these stories were told to entertain people. So you can see it. You can see right now the exact same sort of stories being told, spun out of nothing, whole cloth, for entertainment purposes. They could, in theory, be used to explain things like that, like, why is your computer failing? Well, it's a nanotech invasion from, Hydra. The Captain America version. That's not what people do. That's nothing like what people do. And further, if you pay attention around, you will see cases where people, secular people, entirely secular people, invent gods. For example, this is anytime something is hard, is complicated. And doesn't work out for people. So there's a complicated thing that doesn't work out for people. They'll describe it as things like, or that does, too, that, the gods had something against me, and that's why something or other didn't work out. Or the gods were smiling on me that day, so I happened to pick the right parking spot. It's usually about more complicated things than that, but, be careful, you might anger the gods of the, airplane security, and then they'll pull you over. Is this an actual explanation? The gods of airplane security might get mad at you for, how you put your stuff in your bag and pull you over for added security. Is this bad science as to explaining how you get pulled over for security? They don't know how security works, and so, they posit some gods that must be doing it? No. It is a metaphor. It is a way of describing that you don't understand how things work, but it is as hard to predict as are the decisions of a conscious entity making decisions. Now, people will talk about the gods of the gods of warfare, the gods of video games, the gods of, football. People will talk about the gods of things like airplane security, and so on. These are ways of describing that the world is not intelligible. It doesn't make them more intelligible to describe them this way. It makes them less intelligible, because if there are arbitrary, capricious gods of security who just decide on their own what they like based on what they like, you can't predict it. It's inherently unpredictable. It is describing the inherently unpredictable nature of the thing. Now, there is a tie-in, which you see all over the place within the ancient world, of superstition. This is the attempt to control that which you can't actually control. Now, where people can see some way of controlling it, they use that instead. If you want, to break up the ground, you use a plow. You don't pray to the gods of something or other for that, you use a plow. And similarly, rather than similarly, the thing, if you look at what you would pray to gods for, it was for things you simply can't control. That the crops will grow well, that you will actually get rain. Not to explain where the rain comes from, but rather that the rain actually comes, this highly practical thing. And what happens? Well, what's interesting, there's an interesting analog if you look at people playing video games, and especially older video games, where there is often a random component, like random encounters, for example. Like when you're going along, and then sometimes things will pop out. And, sometimes, you'll find things that you need. No one understands how these things actually work internally, since they didn't program them. Somebody does, not the people playing them. These things make people very superstitious. They come up with all sorts of theories about, like, well, it happens more often when I turn, or it doesn't happen, when I go in a straight line, or it seems better over here, or if I've got this thing equipped. And for all you know, the game designers did in fact take that into account. And so you are attempting to control this thing that you can't really control, and you're looking for, patterns that you can find in the data in order to control it. But if you can't, you get really, really deeply frustrated. That frustration needs some sort of outlet, hence superstition, in the the sense of how the ancients would worship their gods. You want a good harvest. There's a few things you can do in your power, like plowing the soil and so on. Taking off the weeds, making sure to use good seed and so on. Chasing off animals that might destroy it. Okay, those things are within your control. Lots of stuff isn't, about things like the weather and whether or not funguses show up and so on. These things are simply out of your control as a farmer in the ancient world, but sitting there doing nothing feels terrible. So what do? Well, you can ask the god of the harvest, not the harvest, the god of the wheat, please make this work out. Here, look, I'll pour some wine on this altar that I made to you. I hope that works. This is an expression of how people want control over what they can't control, and when they have nothing they can be doing that is useful to the purpose, they want to be occupied doing something. And so they come up with superstition, where at least you're doing something. Now, how much do they really believe this actually worked? It's a really good question, and probably varies with the individual. But it answers the basic human need to do something. And again, looking to modern analogs, it is very much, especially in the aftermath of Christianity, out of favor to do actual sacrifices of this fashion. Though there were a lot of things you will see in programming that were called useless activities that you would do just in case they might work anyway. They were called, in programming circles, waving a dead chicken. This is somewhat old terminology now. But is from the idea that, like, well, I see no possible connection between these things, but sometimes stuff works where there's no possible connection. And they'd be things like, well, let me try deleting this file and running the program then, or let me try restarting the computer, or other things where, like, I've got no reason to believe this will work, but I don't understand it, so these are things I can at least try. And then almost invariably they would never work. Every once in a while they would. But for another modern analog, look at what happens in the wake of tragedies. People who are religious pray for those who have been affected. There's an earthquake or shooting or what have you. Outbreak of disease. You pray for the people affected. Now, according to the religious people, this may do something because they are asking an omnipotent God to do things, and while that omnipotent God has to take into account far more than they themselves can, and therefore their prayers may not be answered in any sort of way they find intelligible, because what they're asking for in a literal sense can't be answered in a literally intelligible way while managing an entire universe simultaneously, working this all out to the good, it is at least possible that these prayers will actually have some useful effect, especially because in a general theme of delegation that tends to exist within creation, it is possible that there is some amount of power given to us in ways that we don't consciously understand that will produce some effect here. That is to say, religious people believe that prayer can be helpful. What do secular people do in this case? Now, I mean, apart from laugh at the religious people, do secular people in general, in the wake of tragedies and so on, go, sucks to be you? No. They want to do something, because, there are these other people who are doing something. So they send thoughts. You see this all over the place. My thoughts go out to them, sending them thoughts. Nobody, absolutely nobody whatsoever, anywhere, believes that thoughts do a damn thing. Nobody, secular or religious, believes that merely thinking about a person who has suffered a tragedy does that person any good whatsoever, even slightly. And yet, when you are so far removed from them that there is nothing you can do, but yet you feel for them, you've seen pictures of their tragedy, you want to do something, well, sending thoughts is doing something, but at least it's an activity to actually type out, I am sending you thoughts. good thoughts you can put in. Yes, because the quality of the thoughts definitely has a causal link of some kind whatsoever. Now, I know there's some atheists so incredibly addicted to saying that prayer doesn't do anything that they will miss this point. Frankly, people determined to miss a point can miss it. But the point is, the people involved believe differently. The religious person believes they are doing something which could actually be helpful. The irreligious person does not believe sending thoughts could actually be helpful, and yet they do it. Because what else are they going to do? And there you can see that impulse to superstition, that impulse to, I can't control the harvest, so I'll pray to the god of the harvest. This is not an attempt to explain things. There is no gap of knowledge here that's even relevant. This is an attempt to control what you don't know. What you can't control. And this applies to controlling things. This applies, by the way, to controlling things that you understand but simply can't control. Things entirely outside of it. Like, you'll even see people who, do very superstitious things on a bowling lane. They roll the ball down. At this point, they know exactly how things are going, but they have no control to steer the ball at this point. And yet, they will still be doing superstitious things in the hope that the ball will, do what they want it to. There is that human impulse to control, which manifests itself in superstition, which manifests itself in things that people who don't actually believe this does anything do all the time. So that's the actual origin of a great deal of pagan religion. And there's a reason why, if you actually look at, for those cultures that actually had philosophers, when the philosophers would look at this, their basic output was like, this is nonsense. The philosophers tended to disagree with the common man rather vehemently, because it's not like the common man was dealing with something that really was true, whereas the philosophers were aiming after truth. There was just that fundamental disconnect, because that had nothing to do with truth. So you can still, of course, it would still be possible to bring forward the charge that, God is just hoping that you can control the universe. This is a variant on the fear of death idea. Religion is fear of death. So you can still bring forth that idea. That sort of thing at least has some possible connection to why religion exists. I mean, that's not it. That's not actually true. But it's at least not directly contrary to what actually happened and what we know about what actually happened and what we know of human beings in general. The God of the Gaps is an explanatory thing. This narrative is just ludicrously ahistorical. Why does it exist at all? Well, it's a powerful story that helps an atheist to explain away this phenomenon of religion. So kind of ironically, this narrative exists basically for the sort of purpose that it pretends to itself be explaining away. Why does this religion thing exist? Well, here's a story that kind of gives some explanation for how this thing exists. So anyway, it's a curious thing with regard to the God of the Gaps. Narratives are very powerful, of course. It's a story, and so therefore it is very compelling. People think often primarily in the stories. But it's kind of funny if you actually try to look at it and ask, is this thing true? It's really, really, really far from being true. So, until next time, may you hit everything you aim at.